Well, here's Adam and... Hold on. Where's Chris?
Hello. I've spent so much quality time with Chris Mason, my Newscast co-host this week, because we were in Manchester at the Conservative Party conference together. I thought we were having a great time. He's just messaged me to say he's going to be doing this episode of Newscast from home. So, not sure what I did. Anyway, we still have lots to talk about because we are still talking on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Chris in the between conferences thing of talking to you from home.
Oh, I'm disappointed we're not seeing your living room, but like through the keyhole. Anyway, keeping me company in my living room is former government advisor Anita Boateng. Hello.
Hello.
Did you get cold shivers watching a conference unfold, thinking back to the old days?
A little bit. There is something, you're much more anxious watching someone make a speech than giving it yourself because you're praying they don't mess anything up.
Also here is Matt Chorley. You've got so many hats now. Journalist, presenter, author. Which one would you like me to introduce you as?
Well, as we're here to plug the book, let's go to author.
And also host of your own show on Times Radio.
Very good.
And also helping us out because there's been a big public health element to party conference season this week. It's Dr. Zan Van Tulleken. Hello.
Can I wear my children's television presenter hat?
I still do years later. So that's very welcome to.
That's my favourite hat.
Chris, now that you've had a chance to sleep on what happened at Tory Party conference, kind of what will you kind of remember?
I think I'll remember that it was conventional, unlike the Conservative conference of a year ago, and then it was Rishi Sunak doing stuff to get noticed, really. And I'm not saying purely for that. I don't mean to sound sort of too cynical, but he had concluded, his team had concluded that, you know, you couldn't do the sort of steady as he goes routine any longer. They need to do stuff that got people talking, got them noticed, caused a bit of a row, including in their own party. And as they see it, the kind of authentic Rishi Sunak who's not been able to do that kind of stuff until now. So we've had all of those rows about HS2 that, you know, finally came to a head with the announcement on Wednesday. The stuff around reforming post-16 education in England. And then the stuff that just today for me, coming back from Manchester, I've been really kind of kicking around in my head, which is this idea about, you know, banning smoking for the next generation. And it got me thinking, is that the thing, despite all the noise about HS2 over the last couple of weeks, is that the thing that has the potential to be the most sort of profound and long-lasting? You know, you think of things that previous governments have done that are highly unlikely to be unpicked, you know, like banning smoking in public places or gay marriage, for instance. Could this be the next one of these things?
Well, we've got a doctor in the house. What's the answer to Chris's question there? Is this as huge as it might appear, or maybe it's not as huge as it appears?
Well, it's huge in that I want to cheer for it because this is the government doing something about health, or at least they're saying they're going to do something. They haven't passed it yet. If they do pass it, they can still delay it. And if they don't delay it, they don't have to implement it or enforce it. But assuming that all happens and they're serious about it, anything that a government does to take health seriously is a really big deal because this government and most governments, health is not big on the agenda. Tobacco kills 64,000 people a year in the UK. It's responsible for 1 in 4 cancers. And it is a really, really big issue. So I'm cheering for it. It's really big, but it is not part of a coherent health package. It does show willingness to care about health, but this is the health of people who don't yet vote. It doesn't impact anyone who's voting for this government. And I don't think anyone is voting for a government saying, look, I want to protect the freedom of my children and grandchildren to smoke. That's fine. They're going to be able to smoke, so it's not a problem. In terms of prohibition, which is the thing that people get very nervous about, yes, there are probably unanticipated consequences to any kind of prohibition, but this sort of sidesteps that, at least for a while, because although there's a strange situation if you might be a 34-year-old living with a 35-year-old at one point and you can't buy cigarettes but your partner can, still, that means there's a regular supply of taxed, well-regulated, quality-controlled, non-illegal cigarettes in the UK for a while. And so that probably means the black market concerns that industry are raising aren't too big of a deal. But my concern is this is the most straightforward political way of approaching health, and it's not tackling things, alcohol, inactivity, and diet-related ill health, those things together are a huge problem, and the government has shown real unwillingness to do anything about that.
I'll pick your brains about a few of those things in a second. But Matt, I mean, you as a political journalist of long standing have lived through a lot of those big changes that Chris was talking about. Does this feel the same as some of those massive ones?
I mean, I suppose sometimes what you're looking for out of a party conference speech is at least a policy that everyone can understand. And actually, HS21 we thought was straightforward. It's not happening, and then it became much more complicated when it became whether or not the Bradford station was already going to be rebuilt or not. It's an eye-catching policy. It's in public health, which actually in more recent times, Conservative prime ministers, of which we've had several, have stepped to. Boris Johnson had a brief spell of being quite keen about doing things on public health, and then
for about 2 weeks.
For about 2 weeks, then he went back and found the cheese in the fridge, and then that was all off again. So, having not gone ahead with a salt tax and wanted to step back from the sugar tax, this is an interesting sort of fight to pick. The interesting thing is everyone say, well, this is like New Zealand, but actually New Zealand, they are doing it, but they're doing it alongside massively cutting the number of shops which can sell. About 90% of the shops that can sell cigarettes won't be able to. And they're moving towards nicotineless cigarettes and things as well. So to try and move people, so doing just one little bit of a thing which has only just been introduced on the other side of the world doesn't necessarily mean it's going to have that much. It does feel more like they cast around for what's a long-term decision.
to match the slogan.
To match the slogan. Long-term decision. This is going to take years before it has any impact. For a brighter future, it's probably brighter if people aren't smoking.
Anita, as a Tory watcher, do you think this has got the potential to be a bit of carnage on the Tory benches, and that's why they're making it a free vote, so people can just vote how they want?
I mean, I definitely think there is a libertarian strand within the Conservative Party that's going to be looking very closely at this. I guess my sense is, I think there's some fairness to what Matt is saying around how this is fit within the coherent whole, and likewise Zand. And my sense is that Rishi Sunak just personally believes in this quite a lot, clearly. And I think he's seeing it as the exception to the rule where there needs to be more intervention, which seems to me to be much more about how you address the norms around smoking. And I think what we've seen from the smoking ban in public places was less about sort of, well, then you end up in a silly situation where on this side of the line you can smoke and this side of the line you can't, which I guess is technically true. But it did sort of make it so that people could comfortably not smoke and not be around smoking, and therefore wouldn't necessarily take it up.
I mean, there will now be like a kind of House of Commons and House of Lords process to make this the law. As a public health advocate and campaigner, would you see that as an opportunity to maybe like try and toughen it up? I'm sure there'd be some members of the House of Lords, maybe the Labour Party, would be like, oh, let's go further, add some extra stuff in there.
So I talk about my wife, Dr. Dolly, all the time, because this is her. I mean, I would say she is the world expert in government's failure to pass health policies of any kind, particularly obesity policies. We've had almost 700 obesity policies in the last 3 decades. One of them has been implemented. So I think rather than watering it down, I'd say like cheer for it all the way, push it all the way through. The sugar tax is deeply flawed, but I'm cheering for it because it shows that somebody cares. But as you say, your point about Rishi Sunak's personal agenda here is so interesting, because at the same time as reducing tobacco consumption, great, as we run up to the election, we will see him pulling pints. Now, he doesn't, as far as I know, he doesn't drink. He may be pulling non-alcoholic pints, but all the politicians are going to be pulling pints. And you think alcohol kills about 20,000 people a year in the UK. Okay, a third as many as smoking, but it's still a huge problem. Inactivity, they're rolling back the 15-minute cities. The idea that we could walk to the GPs and the shops, that seems like a lovely idea that everyone would want and is, in a way, quite a conservative idea. And instead, the big demons you've got to slay in public health, inactivity, poor diet, alcohol, he's ignoring or making things worse. Tobacco, yes, he is addressing that. So I wouldn't try and fiddle with it. I'd be like, at least let's try and take this win, because I don't see us as in the public health community getting any big wins anywhere else.
Chris, are you detecting any appetite, health pun there, for kind of clamping down on anything else? Or actually, now that they've done this smoking ban or promised this smoking ban, that's kind of like box ticked, let's go on to the next thing?
So I think the argument we've certainly heard from the Prime Minister is that the reason he feels he can have as strong a conviction as he does on smoking, whereas he treads more carefully on other stuff, cake, sugar, whatever, is the argument, and Dr. Zan, I'd be interested in your sort of take on this, that there's no safe level of smoking cigarettes, whereas I guess if you eat cakes or chocolate or whatever in moderation and responsibly, perhaps it can be part of a kind of balanced week alongside exercise, etc., etc. So I think he has a sort of definitive view that smoking is an unalloyed bad, and therefore what policy lever could a government attempt? And there's the sort of model from New Zealand, albeit, as you say, Adam, in a slightly different context and a different way of it being suggested. Whereas the other stuff, which governments of various colours and leaderships recently have flirted with without necessarily getting very far with, are seen to be that bit more tricky politically. I guess maybe as well on that kind of whole argument about what it is reasonable for the state to, if not ban, then put taxes on and make prohibitively expensive for some, if it is possible to consume that thing in moderation and therefore safely.
So the point you're raising is a really interesting one. It's actually a very odd way of having the argument, because almost all things that harm you are what you'd call dose dependent. A small amount isn't nearly as dangerous as a large amount. One cigarette a year, I'm not recommending it to anyone. It may start you on the path to more, but one cigarette a year isn't going to do you any more harm than one packet of crisps a year. And as the dose increases, so the harms increase. And the two things are quite analogous in lots and lots of ways. The marketing of tobacco, as we've seen over the last few weeks, if you've been following it, the Philip Morris marketing strategies used by food companies to market addictive products in very similar ways. Your question to Chris was so interesting because you were asking about the appetite for the Conservative Party to do anything more about it, for the government to do anything more about it. There is a huge public appetite for improved regulation around diet-related ill health, particularly around children. Things like marketing of junk food to kids has very, very wide public support. And people don't think that. People think, oh, the public want the freedom. No, almost all of us are on a diet the entire time. The majority of the country is struggling with their weight. I've spent my entire adult life struggling with it. Most people are like, set me free. Please don't have all these posters and this food everywhere. Just give me an apple and let me try and relax for a minute. And so lots of people want this. And, it would be less politically expensive maybe than the government thinks.
I'm just thinking about exercise. We've had years now of loads of positive messages about exercise. There's leisure centres all over the place. There are so many more cycle lanes since the pandemic. There's like free classes here, free classes there. There's gyms and parks all over the place. What is it going to take to get people doing more? We carry pedometers around in our pockets every day as well. What's it going to take?
So it is very difficult, despite all the things you're saying, it is very difficult to live an active life in the UK at the moment, because having a leisure centre nearby is great, but often you still have to pay for it. And even if you can pay for it, there are barriers in terms of time and in terms of culture, opportunity, willingness, norms. All those things need to shift. And often the advice to exercise is grounded in tackling the obesity crisis. Obesity and exercise are not very related. Exercise is a terrible way of losing weight. As anyone who's exercised a lot will know, it doesn't really help. Exercise is very, very good for you. But at a population level, things like the war on cars, or the war on cars at the moment that we're seeing, make life much more difficult. So we are seeing more cycle lanes, but we're also seeing a big pushback from that. Public transport isn't being built. Taking a train to Manchester is very different to driving in terms of your walk at either end, potentially. And so
depends how long the platform is.
It depends, well, exactly, and whether you sit in first class or in,
or if you
anyway.
just stand on the way.
Yeah, exactly. All these things, you just walk up and down the carriage the whole time. So all these things, it is terribly difficult. Government policy to influence exercise is really about making life more active. And that clashes with the cost of living crisis, how time poor we are, all sorts of other things that people want to do.
Zan, thank you very much.
It's always a treat to be on. Thank you for having me.
Now, Chris, talking of conferences and making the news, can I get your review of my doorstepping technique as illustrated in this photo of me with my orange Mac matching my moustache and microphone, and Andy Street running away from my question?
Yeah, as if to emphasise that the podcast and radio experience is often so much richer than the television one. For those of you not watching and merely needing a description of what Adam was wearing, garish orange coat, I think, does a reasonable job of describing it. And which is more garish, Adam's coat or Andy Street's tie? I think, pull Adam's coat. But Andy Street, the Conservative mayor of the West Midlands, had a pretty colourful tie on. I think you were doing some top doorstepping action, weren't you, there? Just after that little press scrummage next to the Midland Hotel in Manchester the other night, when Andy Street had sort of pleaded for the saving of the northern leg of HS2, falling on well, if not deaf ears that listened and decided to ignore him.
Talking about ignoring, Anita, do you think actually the public will have ignored the whole toing and froing about HS2, which we were all agonising about for days at the conference, and that's what Andy Street was doing there?
Yeah.
Do you think actually there'll be any long-term impact to the Conservative brand at all?
So I miss the pollster that used to track salience very consistently. So you could see, like, what stories have you noticed this week and that kind of thing? Because I do think the fact of HS2 and the fact there's been a conversation about it will definitely have cut through. And I don't really know people that I encounter, whether on the doorstep, in the pub, wherever, who actually don't have a view about HS2, whether a sort of, oh, we need a bit more investment, or it's not enough, a good use of money, or... So I think it is a good, knotty political issue that is founded in some substance. But whether people are able to sort of understand the nuances of what's actually been decided in terms of like knowing enough of the detail, I'm not sure. I guess the most important thing that the Prime Minister will want people to come away with is the fact that the PM looked at this in detail, doesn't think it's going to work, doesn't think it's going to have an impact fast enough, and he's got a plan that's better. And if that is what lands, then I think that will be a success for him. And the other thing to say is that quite a lot of what's happening with Number 10 and its policy swings at the moment, it's not just about the sort of let Rishi be Rishi, to sort of paraphrase a rather well-worn West Wing phrase. It's also that, you know, the Isaac Levido team, the strategy team that's working in CCHQ.
Oh yeah, tell us a bit more about Mr. Levido.
Well, I mean, you know, the Australian sort of thought to be a kind of mastermind behind some of the recent election campaigns. And one key part of that strategy is about triangulation, and it's about finding particular sets of voters. So this is not about, for instance, a net zero announcement appealing to all sorts of voters across the country who have varying views about net zero and climate change. This is about identifying a specific subset of voters who are particularly important in key seats that actually are concerned about cost, for instance, and saying, well, I'm going to be more pragmatic for you.
And Matt, your book, which is about places, and Rishi Sunak's announcement about HS2, which is all about places, is a reminder that our electoral map is a lot more complicated than just a set of polls, which maybe shows Labour 20 points ahead.
Yeah, that's completely right. And you're obviously much more into this if you're in Manchester or Birmingham, as Andy Burnham and Andy Street will tell you, as the mayors of those places. Then if you're in Cornwall or Dundee, you're probably sort of watching that, thinking, what's going on? I think the bigger picture is that in order to do all of this, Rishi Sunak has had to trash the last 13 years of Conservative government. Boris Johnson did
the last 30.
Well, 30,
he
of
went
course.
Back 30, didn't
all
he?
the way back to 1993, when Meatloaf was number one. So I don't know why he's got a problem with that. But in order to do, Boris Johnson managed to do that quite successfully when he became Prime Minister, sort of reinvent himself as a brand new government, as if he had nothing to do with Theresa May and David Cameron. It's a very hard trick to pull off. I don't think even Rishi Sunak would say he'd got the same sort of bombastic charisma to pull that off. And when your pitch now is nobody's taken a big decision on this. This hasn't been built. We haven't sorted out the NHS. We haven't sorted out public health. We haven't sorted out transport. We haven't. The answer is, well, whose fault's that then? And he hasn't been Prime Minister for that whole time, but he's been in government for quite a lot of it. And I think that's the thing that makes it a hard sell, rather than the ins and outs of the train station or whatever.
Yeah, Anita, deciding to be like the change candidate when you're in the governing party, is that quite a bold move and quite a difficult thing to pull off? Like, would you have advised to go down that route, or you said, oh, it's going to be really hard to convince people?
I always come back to the, and it's the thing that Danny Finkelstein says quite a lot, another Conservative advisor, about what kinds of elections you can run. You can run a sort of time for a change. You can run a we're on track, don't look back. Or you can run a better the devil you know. And it's always better to run as the change candidate. And I think the Conservative
But that's
Party,
the advice to the opposition. It's very hard to be that if you're in government.
I think it's hard, but it's not impossible, especially if voters do not have a fixed view of you and they only sort of are forming an impression of you. So I think that, in a way, I don't feel as though Sir Keir Starmer is trying to capture the I am the change candidate thing. So why not take a big swing? Why not go for it? And yes, and we'll discover whether voters will completely buy it. But I think if Rishi is trying to be more of himself and talk about things that he really cares about, I think there is room for him to say, well, actually, I've looked at the country. You know I'm different to Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. I've earned sort of trust in that. And then let's see what I can do.
It might not work, but it might be better than all the other ideas which are more likely not to work.
And what's more, I think the fact that Keir Starmer is by nature quite a cautious man, and we've seen it in the response to whether it's net zero or HS2 going, well, I mean, we'll see what happens. It does allow the Prime Minister to sort of contrast himself with the natural caution of Keir Starmer. And then it sort of means that he struggles to generate any excitement about his ideas. And there isn't this kind of push and pull that has voters sort of thinking, well, what do I do? When you've got all the dynamism on one side, I think there is a sort of ability, and you can see the sort of hope of number 10 that you build some momentum around the idea of a sort of excitement or even sort of uncertainty or unpredictability to what Rishi Sunak is going to want to do to change the country.
It's interesting, because it'll be interesting to see what impact this has. If we get to the weekend and the polls are still basically the same, 15, 20-point lead for Labour, and like you were saying, Labour get to then basically react to the whole thing, attack what the Tories have done and set out their own stall. All Keir Starmer needs to do is to carry on coasting. Rishi Sunak is the one, and if this doesn't work, well, what does he do then?
Well, Anita was saying there's 3 options, isn't there? So
you
go for the third option. Right, now, Matt, your book is called Planes, Trains, Toilet Doors. I can remember some things that have happened on planes, some things that happened on trains. What's the toilet door?
So when I started to write this book, which is 50 places that changed British politics, in fact, it was bought out of Barnard Castle, because the English Heritage, who run Barnard Castle, put out a press release saying that the number of visitors to Barnard Castle had gone up by 20%. Post-pandemic. As a result, I assume, of people going and making eye test jokes and Dominic Cummings and and all of that. So we got talking about this on my radio show, and Times Radio's listeners started sending in other places that political nerds
so this is crowdsourced.
should go. A little bit. A lot of them weren't very good. And lots of people started saying, you have to do Granita, of course. Granita was the restaurant in North London where in 1994, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown went and sealed the deal as to who's going to be leader.
Except it's now called...
Well, it's now a ladies' clothes shop.
No, I think it's now called Desperados.
Some of us have written a book about this and have carried out some extensive... It was called Desperados, a Mexican restaurant. I think it might have then become an optician's, then it was shut, and now I think it's like a ladies' clothes shop. But the interesting thing is, both sides, Brownites and Blairites, they don't agree on much. They do agree that Granita was not that big a deal, that all the discussions happened before. And after John Smith died in 1994, there were these conversations about who was going to run. And Gordon Brown was clearly the more senior. Tony Blair was the sort of young upstart, but he was clearly polling better. And they kept having these conversations in the homes of friends of Tony Blair, which gave an indication as to which direction this would go. And in one of these occasions, they went to this guy's house, Nick Ryden, who had a house in Edinburgh because everyone was in Scotland because of the death of John Smith. And Nick Ryden leaves in the house with like a bottle of whiskey and an Indian takeaway menu and goes to the pub. Gordon Brown goes to the toilet. Tony Blair is just sitting in the front room, and the phone rings, and being the early 90s, an landline answering machine kicks in. Because it wasn't his house, he just let it go to the answering machine. And said, hi, it's Nick, I'm not in, but leave a message. And then this voice comes booming out of the machine, Tony, it's Gordon. I'm locked in the toilet. And both of them tell this story in their memoirs. And actually, Tony Blair doesn't mention Granita at all in his memoirs. And Tony Blair goes to the toilet door and shouts to the door to Gordon, I'll only let you out if you pull out of the Labour leadership race. And that was the moment that the Labour, possibly Labour leadership race was decided. And it's a reminder that stuff happens, actually not at party conferences. Most party conferences are quite forgettable, apart from the one last year, Tory party conference. Stuff happens in weird places.
Matt, you've got to tell the story of Vince Cable and the bubble bath.
I can see that.
Luckily, this is on TV after the watershed.
Yeah, but there aren't any images. Well, in fact, there are images. I was once at a Lib Dem conference because that's how I like to spend my time.
Yeah.
And I was told that there were photos of Vince Cable in the bath in circulation, and it was one of those things. You'll know this from having been a spin doctor. When you say to someone, "What's all this about Vince Cable and the photos in the bath?" and the spin doctor kept saying, "How do you know about that?" And so that's all the confirmation you need. And it turned out his wife had finished a film or something and takes photos and then take them to be developed, and they'd ended up in the hands of a newspaper who then didn't want to print them. But the important part of Vince Cable in the Bath is in 2007, he was acting leader of the Lib Dems. Gordon Brown was having a nightmare after having had quite a good summer. Everything he touched went wrong. They lost stuff and the government was in the right pickle. Cash for parties and all that. And Vince Cable was in the Bath when he came up with the line that the House will have noticed the transformation from Stalin to Mr. Bean.
Oh, so actually that's an important
He
bath.
did all of his big thinking. In
like
the bath.
Archimedes.
Like Archimedes' bath. Cleopatra, you know.
Did he have bubble bath?
I've not.
A bath bomb?
Some of these.
I presume.
Some of the places in the book I've been to, that is not one of them.
Anita, when you were an advisor, is there a particular place that has lodged in your memory forever where like something really massive happened?
I mean, there are certain parts of both party conferences.
I'm just giving Matt ideas for volume 2.
Oh, gosh.
50 more slightly less good places. Go on.
No, I mean, I think you're going for 100 next time.
Yeah,
surely. There are certain places actually in Manchester and Birmingham where I have kind of very distinct memories. So one is when Theresa May, this is 2018, this is the year after the P45 and the letters.
And the cough.
And the cough. And that, oh gosh, that one I watched with about 50 other special advisors. It was agonising. But this one was the one where they played ABBA and she started dancing. And I was watching it with all of her most senior teams, sort of select group of about 5, director of comms, chief of staff. And everyone sort of froze because it was not planned. And they were like, we should have told her not to do that. And for the rest of the speech, all they were doing is just sort of standing like this. So every time I walk past that room, I have a distinct memory of being the most uncomfortable I think I've ever been, watching for 50 minutes people stress about the fact that she'd sort of tried to do a bit of a jig at the beginning of that speech.
And Chris, as a fellow geographer, so we've got a book about political places, some of which we've been to, and we've had a week dominated by maps of new train lines and where there's most potholes. It's great that a sense of place is being restored to British politics.
Absolutely. Place and maps and kind of belonging and identity. Oh, you know, where geography and politics meet. That is a sweet spot.
Much like the Newscast studio. Thank you very much for you two being here on the sweet spot. I'm afraid I don't think anything memorable enough has happened in here for it to make it into volume 2.
I'll give it time.
We'll give it. You probably got. It takes a couple of years to write them, doesn't it?
No, it took me about 6 months.
Okay. And did you go to? How many of the places did you actually go to?
Quite a few. I mean, a lot of them, they're like houses or with a plaque outside. I swam in the pool where Christine Keeler met John Perfumer. That was probably the most fun. And I went to
It's quite a fancy hotel, isn't it?
at Clifton, and I went to the Co-op on the Strand where they filled a suitcase full of booze for the parties in Downing Street.
Now, I was walking down that way to get to the Newscast studio today, and the thing that always got me is like there is a closer supermarket. Why did they go to the Co-op rather than the Tesco? Now, this is very SW1 bubble, but it's very important for me to know.
That Tesco's too small, I think.
I think it's too small and a bit conspicuous. You might be spotted by journalists and, you know, Westminster people. I know exactly where I first met Chris Mason.
Oh.
It was in a hotel in Plymouth for a Lib Dem leadership hustings with Chris Huhne and Nick Clegg. Do you remember that, Chris?
I do remember that.
Absolutely doesn't.
Yeah.
Well, the first place I met Chris was when we were going to the kind of like the recruitment day for our journalism school where we had to do all the tests.
Wow.
So imagine how history could have turned out differently
You've
if
been
I'd
trained,
passed.
have you?
Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. I mean,
You've done very well.
I missed quite a lot of the lectures. Anyway,
History would have been different had you not been still stuck in that toilet as well. So really, there's all sorts of
so many branches.
sliding doors.
Right, thank you for not missing this episode of Newscast. Thanks to all our guests in the studio. Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Good
Chris, I will see you in. Oh, where we go? Yeah, Liverpool. See you in Liverpool for the Labour Party conference.
See you in Liverpool. Cheers.
And that's all from this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye.
Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
I offer, for your journalistic pleasures, my life's